A student poisoned his own master in his sleep. No duel, no warning, no last words, just silence. And then a Sith Lord who had survived for decades was simply gone. That single, quiet murder would end up shaping the fall of an entire republic. But this isn't a story about the student who pulled it off. This is a story about the teacher who built him, the one who spent a lifetime training the most dangerous minds in the galaxy and never once raised his voice doing it. He has no statue anywhere in the galaxy, no grave marker, no legend told around campfires or whispered in Jedi archives. Most beings alive during his lifetime never learned his name. And the ones who did forgot it almost as quickly. That wasn't an accident. That was the plan. His name was Tenebrous. He trained the man who trained the man who trained Darth Vader. He helped set in motion the slow, invisible collapse of a 1,000-year-old republic, decades before that collapse ever became visible to a single living Jedi. And he did it all so quietly, so patiently, that many historians still argue over how much of his story is even real. What kind of mind spends an entire lifetime working toward a victory it will never live to see? What kind of teacher raises two apprentices in total secrecy, each one unaware the other exists, purely to find out which one deserves to survive? And what happens when that teacher trains his student so completely that the student eventually turns those exact lessons back against him? That's where this story ends. It is not where it begins. Somewhere in the crowded lanes of a world most beings in the galaxy never thought twice about, a child was born who would spend his entire life making absolutely sure no one ever saw him coming. This is the story of the Sith Lord almost nobody remembers, and by the time the galaxy finally understood what his lineage had actually built, he had already been dead for generations, his fingerprints buried so deep in the wreckage of the Republic that almost nobody thought to look for them at all. He was a Bith. If you know the species at all, you probably picture something harmless. Large black eyes, smooth gray domed heads, long delicate fingers built for music and precision instrumentation. Bith are famous across the galaxy for cantina bands and university lecture halls, for orchestras and observatories, for a species so thoroughly associated with art, culture, and intellect that almost nobody would ever look twice at one and think Sith Lord. That was exactly the point. While other dark side users hid behind the raw terror of a red blade or the crushing weight of the Force choke, Tenebrous hid behind something far more effective and far harder to guard against. He hid behind being underestimated, and he wore that disguise so completely that it stopped being a disguise at all. It became simply who he appeared to be every single day for longer than most beings live. Bith physiology made him almost uniquely suited to a life built entirely on secrecy and study. Their species evolved with an extraordinary reliance on hearing and analytical processing over raw physical strength. And many Bith, Tenebrous among them, possessed something close to an eidetic memory, capable of retaining enormous volumes of information with total, permanent precision. Sit with that idea for a moment. Imagine a mind that never really lets anything go. Every betrayal it witnesses, every flicker of weakness, it catalogues in the beings around it. Every scrap of forbidden knowledge it manages to unearth from a ruined temple or a half-destroyed archive. All of it stored perfectly, waiting patiently to be used at precisely the moment it will hurt the most. That was the basic architecture of the mind that would eventually reshape the future of the Sith Order without the rest of the galaxy ever noticing the change had happened. Almost nothing survives about his childhood. And that absence isn't simply an accident of history. It's a preview of exactly the kind of being he would spend his whole life becoming. Tenebrous devoted himself, from a young age, to making sure that no record existed of anything he didn't personally choose to leave behind. What little can be pieced together from fragments and rumor suggests he was already connected, however loosely at first, to the hidden lineage of Sith descending from Darth Bane, a chain of masters and apprentices stretching back through generation after generation. Each one taught the exact same brutal law. Only two may exist at any time: a master to embody power, and an apprentice to hunger for it, locked together in a relationship that could only ever end one way. By the time Tenebrous inherited the mantle from whoever came before him in that chain, the rule had already claimed the lives of dozens of Sith Lords, whose names never survived long enough to become legend. He understood, better than almost anyone else who had ever carried that title, exactly what the rule actually was. Not a sacred tradition to be honored. A machine, cold and mechanical, engineered to produce monsters efficient enough to eventually survive their own kind. What set Tenebrous apart from the Sith who came before him was never raw power alone, although by every account he had plenty of it stored beneath that calm exterior. It was patience stretched to a length that should be almost impossible for any living creature to sustain without breaking, where lesser Sith Lords burned bright and died young, consumed by their own impatience or their own carelessness, undone by the very ambition that had made them dangerous in the first place. Tenebrous approached the entire philosophy of the dark side, the way a scientist approaches an experiment that might take an entire lifetime to yield results. Every move calculated years in advance, every risk weighed carefully against its long-term cost. Every relationship, every alliance, every apprentice, evaluated purely and coldly in terms of what it might eventually produce. He did not want glory. He did not crave a throne room with his name carved somewhere above the door. He wanted something far colder, far quieter, and far more permanent than any empire built in his own lifetime. He wanted to become the invisible hand shaping the collapse of civilizations he would never personally live to see fall. This is where the horror of his story really starts to take hold. Because Tenebrous was playing a game with a timeline longer than most sentient lifespans could even comprehend. He was not plotting revenge for some personal injury. He wasn't driven by grief over a lost love or hatred for a particular enemy. The kinds of motivations that at least make other Sith Lords recognizable as broken, tragic figures underneath all the darkness. Tenebrous simply looked out at the wider galaxy, the way a physician studies a body already riddled with disease, and decided, with total clinical detachment, that the disease should be allowed to fester for exactly as long as it took to guarantee a fatal outcome. He wasn't trying to win any war within his own lifetime. He was quietly setting traps that wouldn't spring for generations, entirely confident that whoever eventually inherited his work would be sharp enough and cold enough to finish precisely what he had started so many years before. Bith culture and Bith society gave him the perfect place to hide in plain sight for as long as he needed. His species held prominent, respected positions across galactic academia, in research institutes, conservatories, and cultural circles that almost never drew a second glance of suspicion from an order like the Jedi. An order that spent most of its attention watching for anger and open violence, not quiet, soft-spoken beings taking careful notes in a private study somewhere far from the noise of galactic politics. Tenebrous used this camouflage the way a predator uses total stillness, while the Jedi searched for the loud, obvious signatures of the dark side. A Sith Lord, cutting down enemies in some public square. Tenebrous sat in libraries, in observatories, in shadowed private chambers, quietly absorbing centuries of Sith knowledge that had been scattered, buried, and nearly lost after the ancient wars that gutted the old Sith empires of the deep past. He didn't simply inherit the rule of two from whoever trained him. He went hunting for its buried, forgotten history, piece by piece, reconstructing forbidden philosophies and lost techniques that his own master might never have shown him directly, until he understood the tradition he served more completely than the very teachers who had first initiated him into it. And here is where his particular brand of horror really begins to take its full shape. Because unlike almost every Sith Lord who came before him, Tenebrous broke the rule of two, quietly, deliberately, without a single flicker of guilt or hesitation. He took not one apprentice, but two, running them in parallel for years at a time, each one completely unaware of how replaceable their master truly considered them to be. His first apprentice was a fellow Bith, a promising and dangerous student who would come to be known as Darth Venomous, groomed in almost total secrecy for years before anyone else in the lineage even knew he existed. Venomous trained under Tenebrous, believing himself to be the sole future of the Sith line, the next link in a chain stretching back 1,000 years, chosen and singular and irreplaceable. He had no idea that his master was quietly cultivating a second, far more promising student on the far side of the galaxy, a cold and endlessly patient member of the Muon species who would one day take the name Darth Plagueis. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it says everything about who Tenebrous truly was underneath the calm, scholarly exterior. He looked at the single most sacred, ironclad law that had protected and defined his order for 1,000 years. The one rule every Sith Lord before him had been taught to treat as absolutely inviolable, and he decided it was simply inconvenient. Not because he wanted to overthrow Sith tradition or build some grand new philosophy of his own, the way certain heretics elsewhere in the lineage would later try and fail to do. He broke the rule for the exact same reason he did everything else in his long and quiet life: insurance. If one apprentice failed him, disappointed him, or proved too weak to survive the brutal weight of his training, he would simply have another one waiting patiently in reserve, and neither student would ever know they had been nothing more than a contingency plan rather than a chosen heir to everything he knew. Two apprentices, groomed in parallel for years, each one utterly convinced of their own unique destiny, each one completely unaware that their beloved master viewed them as interchangeable pieces on a board only he could actually see the shape of. Training under a mind like that was never simply painful. It was designed, from the very first lesson, to be a form of total psychological reconstruction, thorough enough that anyone who survived it would never again be capable of experiencing the galaxy the way an ordinary being does. Tenebrous did not merely teach lightsaber forms or the basic mechanics of the dark side, the kind of instruction any moderately competent Sith could offer a promising student. He taught his apprentices patiently and repeatedly to see every relationship as a transaction waiting to be settled, every act of kindness as a weakness in need of correction, every emotion as raw fuel to be processed, refined, and eventually burned rather than simply felt the way lesser beings felt things. Plagueis, the apprentice history actually remembers, would go on to describe his own coldly scientific approach to the Force as something inherited directly from his master's methods, a way of treating even the most intimate mysteries of existence, birth, death, consciousness itself, as problems waiting to be dissected, rather than sacred experiences deserving any kind of respect. That particular coldness did not originate with Plagueis at all. It was installed in him, carefully and deliberately, layer by layer, by a teacher who had spent an entire lifetime perfecting the art of turning promising, hopeful students into instruments with no capacity left for hesitation, doubt, or mercy. There is something uniquely disturbing about a Sith master who never once loses his composure. History and legend are full of dark side users who scream, who rage, who let their hatred consume them in loud, spectacular, almost theatrical ways. Tenebrous offered none of that release, none of that catharsis. Not once, not even under circumstances that would have broken the discipline of almost anyone else in the galaxy. Every account that survives him describes a being of total, unshakable self-control, someone who could stand in the presence of unimaginable cruelty, his own or someone else's, and remain perfectly, chillingly calm the entire time. He did not need to intimidate his apprentices with sudden bursts of violence in the moment, because he had already spent years patiently convincing them that failure, disappointment, any visible weakness at all, would be met with consequences far worse than simple anger. Consequences delivered in the same flat, measured, almost lecturing tone he used to explain a minor point of Sith history during a quiet evening lesson. There is a particular, very specific kind of horror in cruelty delivered without any heat behind it at all. Cruelty that never once bothers to raise its voice, because it tells you with total certainty that the being inflicting it was never even slightly out of control. Not for a single second. Everything Tenebrous did to the people around him, every single time, he did entirely on purpose. The clearest, most horrifying demonstration of exactly what that meant came through Venomous, the secret first apprentice whose entire existence Tenebrous kept hidden from Plagueis for years at a time, waiting for precisely the right moment to let the truth surface. When Plagueis finally learned of his secret rival, later in his own training, the two apprentices, one Bith, one Muon, were forced into direct, brutal confrontation, a final test disguised as an unfortunate accident, the exact kind of trap only a mind like Tenebrous could design so patiently and so far in advance. Plagueis defeated Venomous in that confrontation, and in a detail that says everything about the world Tenebrous had spent years quietly building around both of them, rather than simply killing his defeated rival outright and ending the matter cleanly. Plagueis kept Venomous alive in a suspended, comatose state for years afterward, using his own former brother in training as a living subject for experiments into the boundaries between life and death. Think about the layers of horror stacked inside that single outcome. A master secretly raised two students against one another without either of them fully understanding the stakes of the game they were actually playing. And the surviving apprentice absorbed that same casual, clinical cruelty so completely that he turned his own defeated rival into a science experiment, rather than granting him even the small mercy of a clean death. That is not a coincidence, and it was never meant to be one. That is a curriculum, executed exactly as designed. Tenebrous didn't simply teach the dark side to the students beneath him. He taught an entire philosophy of treating other living beings as disposable material. And by every measure that survives him, it worked exactly as intended. For decades, and quite possibly for far longer than that, Tenebrous operated from the shadows of galactic society, while the Jedi Order convinced itself, generation after complacent generation, that the Sith had been extinct for 1,000 years. That false confidence was the single greatest weapon Tenebrous and his lineage possessed, and he guarded it more jealously than any lightsaber, any ancient holocron, any fragment of forbidden knowledge he had spent his life collecting. He forbade open confrontation among his students. He forbade grand gestures, dramatic displays of power, anything that might draw even a flicker of unwanted attention toward the quiet, careful work he had spent his entire existence protecting. Every piece of Sith knowledge he passed down to his apprentices came wrapped in the exact same warning, repeated so often it became instinct rather than instruction, that the moment the wider galaxy remembered the Sith were real, the entire careful architecture of the plan would come crashing down before it could ever be completed. Where certain Sith lords in the ancient past had reveled in open war, commanding armies and carving empires directly out of the galaxy in blood and fire and spectacle, Tenebrous understood with total clarity that every single one of those wars had ultimately failed for the exact same reason. They gave the enemy something to see, something to organize against, something to eventually, inevitably, defeat. He wanted his students to become masters of appearing as anything but what they truly were underneath. Financiers, academics, quiet, unremarkable figures in unremarkable rooms, indistinguishable from the beings around them, right up until the precise moment it no longer mattered whether anyone finally recognized the danger, because by then, it would already be far too late to stop what had been set in motion. It is worth pausing here to sit inside the sheer scale of what a mind like this was actually attempting, because it is easy to let the scope of it slide past without fully absorbing how strange and how disturbing it really is. Most beings, even most villains, plan for outcomes they expect to witness themselves. They want to see the empire they built. They want to stand in the throne room they conquered. They want, on some basic level, the satisfaction of watching their plan succeed with their own eyes. Tenebrous wanted none of that. Or at least, if he did want it somewhere beneath the calm exterior, he never once allowed that desire to compromise the plan itself. He was, by every surviving account, entirely willing to do decades of patient, invisible work in service of a victory he fully expected other beings not even born yet, to eventually claim in his place. That is not merely ambition. That is something closer to a kind of faith. Except the object of that faith wasn't a god or a prophecy or a cause in any traditional sense. It was simply the mechanism itself. The rule of two, the slow, grinding machinery of betrayal and succession that Bane had built 1,000 years earlier, and that Tenebrous had come to trust more completely than he trusted any living being, including, in the end, himself. That trust in the mechanism above the individual is, in many ways, the single most chilling detail buried inside the entire story of Tenebrous, because it explains everything else that follows. It explains why he could train 2 apprentices in parallel, without ever growing attached enough to either one to compromise the experiment. It explains why he could subject both of them to years of psychological conditioning designed specifically to strip away hesitation, without ever once considering that the same conditioning might one day be turned against him. And it explains, perhaps most disturbingly of all, why the eventual outcome of his life, the outcome that finally arrived after decades of careful, patient work, never seemed to trouble him in the slightest, even though by every reasonable measure he must have understood, at some level, exactly what he was building toward every single time he stood across from his most promising student and handed over another piece of forbidden knowledge that student didn't yet have the power to use against him, because knowledge was always the true currency between Tenebrous and the beings he trained. Far more than lightsaber technique, far more than raw strength in the Force. He understood something that many Sith Lords throughout history had either ignored or actively resisted, that the true measure of power in the dark side was rarely about how hard a being could strike in a single moment of confrontation. It was about how much a being knew, how deeply they understood the mechanisms of politics, biology, history, and manipulation that ran underneath the visible surface of galactic society, and how patiently they were willing to wait before ever using any of it. Tenebrous had spent longer than most beings live simply accumulating that kind of knowledge, hunting down fragments of lost Sith philosophy, scattered across ruined temples and forgotten archives, piecing together techniques that had not been practiced in centuries, reconstructing entire schools of dark side thought from nothing but rumor and half-destroyed records. By the time he began seriously training the students who would eventually inherit his legacy, he was not simply a powerful Sith Lord. He was something closer to a living archive, a single mind holding centuries of buried, dangerous knowledge that the rest of the galaxy had long since assumed was gone forever. And he did not hoard that knowledge the way earlier, more paranoid Sith Lords historically had, withholding crucial secrets from their own apprentices as a form of insurance against betrayal. Tenebrous did something far stranger and, in its own way, far more disturbing. He gave freely. He shared enormous portions of what he knew with both of his secret students, teaching them not merely how to survive as Sith, but how to think the way he thought, how to plan the way he planned, how to hold an idea patiently for years or decades, without ever letting impatience or fear force a premature move. It would be easy to mistake that openness for something like generosity, even something like love, if you didn't understand what it actually was. It was cultivation. Tenebrous wasn't raising students so much as he was growing a successor, carefully selecting which portions of his knowledge to plant in which mind, watching to see which one absorbed the lessons most completely, which one showed the least hesitation, which one would eventually prove capable of carrying the entire weight of everything he had built forward into a future he would never personally see. This is, in the end, the quiet horror sitting underneath every single lesson Tenebrous ever gave. He was not simply teaching his students how to survive in a galaxy that hunted their kind. He was teaching them, patiently and deliberately, exactly how to eventually destroy him. And he did it anyway, without hesitation, because in his mind, his own death was never a tragedy to be avoided. It was simply the final, necessary stage of the experiment, the last data point required to confirm whether everything he had built across a lifetime of careful, invisible work had actually succeeded. A lesser being would have feared that outcome. Tenebrous, by every account that survives him, seemed to view it the way a scientist views the final measurement of a long and difficult experiment. Something to be observed with detached curiosity rather than dread, regardless of what it might ultimately cost him personally. That is the mind the galaxy was dealing with. Decades before most of its inhabitants ever had reason to suspect the Sith still existed at all. Patiently shaping the instrument of its own eventual undoing, one carefully chosen lesson at a time, and never once flinching from where that path was always going to lead. Consider, for a moment, the sheer discipline required simply to maintain a public identity for as long as Tenebrous did. Most Sith Lords throughout history, even the most careful ones, eventually slipped. They let ambition show through in a poorly timed political maneuver, or allowed some flicker of dark side power to leak out during a moment of genuine anger. And that single mistake was often enough for a watchful Jedi to notice something was wrong. Tenebrous never allowed himself that luxury. Whatever public face he wore, whether it was the mask of a respected academic, a quiet cultural figure, or simply an unremarkable Bith, moving unnoticed through crowded galactic marketplaces, he wore it so completely that it ceased to be a performance at all. It became, for all practical purposes, simply another true version of himself. One he could step into and out of, without ever letting the seams show. That kind of total, permanent self-control is rare even among Force-sensitive beings trained from childhood in strict philosophical discipline. It is almost unheard of among Sith Lords. An order defined, at its core, by unchecked ambition and barely restrained hunger for power. Tenebrous somehow managed to possess both, an ambition vast enough to reshape galactic history across multiple generations, and a discipline so absolute that he could sit across from a Jedi Master in ordinary conversation and never once betray the slightest hint of what he actually was. That discipline extended into every corner of his life, including the physical spaces he occupied. Unlike Sith Lords of the ancient past, who ruled from fortresses and temples built specifically to project menace and power, the spaces Tenebrous inhabited were designed to disappear. A private study tucked inside an unremarkable building on a crowded world. A modest observatory maintained under a false name. A quiet archive accessible only to a handful of trusted, unwitting scholars who had no idea what was actually being researched behind those doors. Nothing about these spaces would have drawn a second glance from anyone passing by. And that was precisely the intention. Power, in the philosophy Tenebrous practiced and eventually passed on to his students, was never meant to announce itself. It was meant to accumulate quietly, in rooms nobody thought to search, until the day finally arrived when concealment was no longer necessary, because the outcome had already been secured. Inside those quiet, unremarkable rooms, Tenebrous pursued a body of knowledge that would have horrified almost anyone who stumbled across it by accident. He was, by every surviving account, an obsessive collector of the darkest and most forbidden fragments of Sith history, hunting down holocrons and ancient texts scattered across the ruins of empires that had fallen and risen and fallen again over thousands of years. Some of what he recovered dated back to the earliest, bloodiest wars between the Jedi and the Sith, philosophies so old and so brutal that even later generations of dark side users had considered them too dangerous to preserve. Tenebrous preserved them anyway, not out of nostalgia or reverence for the past, but because he understood, with total clarity, that knowledge discarded by history tends to be knowledge the galaxy has simply forgotten how to defend against. If the Jedi no longer remembered a particular technique, a particular strategy, a particular form of manipulation practiced by Sith Lords centuries dead, then that technique became, in his hands, effectively new again. Effectively invisible. A weapon nobody currently alive had any defense against, because nobody currently alive even remembered it existed. This obsessive, patient hoarding of forgotten knowledge is part of what made his eventual choice of apprentices so deliberate. Tenebrous was not simply looking for raw talent in the Force, the kind of natural ability the Jedi themselves searched for among Force-sensitive younglings across the galaxy. He was looking for a very specific kind of mind, one capable of absorbing enormous quantities of information without becoming overwhelmed by it, one patient enough to sit on that knowledge for years or decades without ever being tempted to use it prematurely, and one cold enough to eventually apply it without hesitation once the moment finally arrived. Venomous, his first secret apprentice, possessed much of that discipline, and for years, Tenebrous seemed genuinely satisfied with the progress of his training. But something in Venomous never quite reached the depth of detachment his master required. He was patient, but not patient enough, disciplined, but still capable, in certain unguarded moments, of something that looked almost like genuine feeling. Tenebrous noticed. Tenebrous always noticed. And rather than correct the flaw directly, rather than risk tipping his hand to a student who might not survive the confrontation that would inevitably follow, he simply began quietly cultivating an alternative, a second student on the far side of the galaxy who showed no such hesitation at all. That second student, the young Muon who would eventually take the name Darth Plagueis, came from a species already culturally predisposed toward exactly the kind of cold, transactional worldview Tenebrous valued above almost everything else. Muons are known across the galaxy for their extraordinary aptitude in finance, banking, and long-term economic strategy. A species that measures relationships, resources, and even time itself in terms of eventual return on investment. Where most beings might find that kind of relentless calculation unsettling, Tenebrous recognized it immediately as raw material perfectly suited to his purposes. A mind already trained from childhood to think in decades rather than days, already comfortable treating enormous, abstract systems as puzzles to be solved rather than mysteries to be feared. He did not need to teach his new apprentice patience from scratch, the way he might have with a more impulsive, emotionally driven species. He simply needed to redirect patience that already existed, pointing it away from currency and markets and towards something far more ambitious: the slow, invisible unraveling of an entire galactic government from the inside out. The training that followed stretched across years, conducted with the same meticulous, almost surgical precision Tenebrous applied to every other aspect of his existence. He did not rush his new apprentice through the fundamentals of the dark side, the way a less patient master might have, eager to see quick results. He built the foundation first, methodically, layer by layer, teaching the history of the Sith lineage, stretching back to Bane, the philosophy underlying the rule of two, the long, brutal list of Sith Lords who had come before and either succeeded through patience or failed through impulsiveness. Only once that foundation was solid did he begin introducing his apprentice to the more dangerous knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating. The forbidden techniques, the forgotten rituals, the fragments of ancient Sith science that would eventually form the basis of his apprentice's own infamous experiments into the nature of life and death itself. Every lesson was calibrated. Every revelation timed precisely to arrive only once the student had demonstrated readiness to receive it, without being destroyed by the weight of it. And throughout all of this careful, patient cultivation, Venomous remained entirely unaware that he was no longer his master's sole priority. He continued training, continued absorbing lessons, continued believing himself to be the chosen future of an ancient and sacred lineage, never once suspecting that somewhere across the galaxy, another student was receiving many of those same lessons in parallel, evaluated against him without his knowledge or consent. There is something almost unbearably cruel about that arrangement when you sit with it long enough, crueler, in some ways, than any single act of direct violence Tenebrous ever committed. He did not merely lie to Venomous about small matters. He built an entire false reality around him, a complete and convincing fiction of unique destiny and singular purpose, maintained for years, purely so that the eventual test, the eventual confrontation between the two unwitting rivals, would produce the cleanest, most decisive result possible. Venomous was never simply a student to Tenebrous. He was a control group in an experiment whose true subject was someone else entirely. And he lived out years of his life inside that experiment without ever once being told the truth of what he actually was. It is worth considering what this reveals about the deeper philosophy Tenebrous practiced. A philosophy that would eventually pass, largely intact, through Plagueis and into the mind of Palpatine himself. The lesson embedded inside the entire Venomous affair was never really about combat superiority or raw power in the Force. Even though the final confrontation between the two apprentices was decided through exactly that. The true lesson, the one Tenebrous seemed most interested in teaching, was that other beings, even beings who called themselves brothers in training, even beings who might have genuinely cared for one another under different circumstances, were fundamentally instruments to be used, tested, and discarded in service of a larger design. Plagueis absorbed that lesson so completely that he would go on to apply it not only to Venomous, keeping his defeated rival alive purely as a subject for experimentation, but eventually to his own apprentice and to countless other beings across a career defined by manipulation on a scale few Sith Lords in history had ever attempted. The horror of Tenebrous was never contained to his own lifetime. It was designed, deliberately and patiently, to outlive him. There is a particular moment, preserved only in fragments and educated reconstruction, when the true scope of what Tenebrous had built finally became visible to his surviving apprentice, and it is worth lingering on because of what it reveals about the master rather than the student. When Plagueis first learned of Venomous, of the secret second apprentice who had been trained in parallel for years without his knowledge, the discovery did not come wrapped in apology or explanation. Tenebrous offered no comfort, no reassurance that his newer student remained the favored one. He simply presented the situation as fact, as though revealing the existence of a rival apprentice were no different from revealing any other piece of strategic information his student needed to survive. This was, perhaps, the single clearest lesson Tenebrous ever taught, delivered not through words, but through the sheer coldness of the delivery itself. Attachment, sentiment, the comfortable assumption of being uniquely valued by someone who has spent years training you. All of it was an illusion. And illusions, in the philosophy of the Sith as Tenebrous understood it, existed only to be stripped away the moment they stopped serving a useful purpose. Plagueis' reaction to that revelation says as much about his own capacity for the dark side as it does about the effectiveness of his master's methods. A lesser student, someone who had not yet fully internalized the cold detachment Tenebrous demanded, might have responded with anger or wounded pride, or some desperate attempt to prove himself uniquely irreplaceable in his master's eyes. Plagueis did none of that. By every account that survives the encounter, he absorbed the information with the same clinical detachment his master had used to deliver it, treating the existence of a rival not as a betrayal, but as simply another variable to be accounted for in an ongoing calculation. That response alone likely told Tenebrous everything he needed to know about which of his two students had actually internalized the deeper philosophy underlying his teachings, and which one remained, despite years of careful training, still fundamentally tethered to something recognizably close to ordinary feeling. The confrontation between Plagueis and Venomous, when it finally came, was staged with the same meticulous precision Tenebrous applied to every other aspect of his long, patient existence. It did not happen by accident. Whatever story might have been told to either apprentice in the moment, Tenebrous engineered the circumstances carefully, ensuring that both students arrived at the same place, believing themselves to be pursuing some other objective entirely, only to discover their supposed rival waiting for them instead. There is something almost theatrical about the cruelty of that setup. A master orchestrating the collision of two lives he had spent years shaping, purely to observe which one would prove stronger, and doing so without ever once stepping in to prevent the outcome, regardless of which student ultimately survived. Whichever apprentice walked away from that encounter, Tenebrous would have lost nothing of real value. He had already extracted everything he needed from the loser the moment the confrontation began, because the confrontation itself was the final, definitive test, and the result, whatever it turned out to be, would simply tell him which mind had been the correct investment all along. When Plagueis emerged victorious, the manner in which he chose to handle his defeated rival revealed just how thoroughly his master's philosophy had taken root. Killing Venomous outright would have been the simpler choice. The choice most Sith Lords throughout history would have made without a second thought. Plagueis instead saw an opportunity, treating his fallen brother in training not as a defeated enemy to be disposed of, but as a resource, a living subject whose body and mind could still yield useful data even in defeat. He kept Venomous suspended in a comatose state for years afterward, returning periodically to conduct experiments into the boundaries between life and death, the same obsession that would eventually define his entire scientific career and shape the destiny of an apprentice not yet born. It is difficult to imagine a clearer demonstration of exactly what Tenebrous had spent years cultivating in his students. Not simply a willingness to kill when necessary, which almost any Sith Lord possessed, but something colder and more disturbing. A total inability to see another sentient being, even one who had once shared years of training and hardship alongside him, as anything other than material to be used for as long as it remained useful. It would be easy, looking back at this story from a safe distance, to imagine that Tenebrous felt something when he learned the outcome of the confrontation he had engineered. some flicker of satisfaction at having correctly identified his true successor, some quiet grief, however small, at the loss of a student he had spent years training, regardless of how coldly that training had been conducted. No surviving account suggests anything of the kind. If Tenebrous felt anything at all, he never allowed it to surface in any way that history managed to record. He simply moved forward, folding the outcome into his ongoing calculations, redirecting the entirety of his remaining attention and remaining knowledge toward the apprentice who had proven himself capable of surviving the test. Whatever Venomous had meant to him across those years of secret training, whatever investment of time and effort and careful instruction had gone into shaping that young Bith into a Sith Lord, all of it was simply written off. The way an investor might write off a failed venture, with no visible hesitation and no visible cost to the calm, methodical continuation of the larger plan. With Venomous removed from consideration, Tenebrous devoted the entirety of his remaining years to the singular task of finishing what he had started with Plagueis, and it is here that the true scale of his ambition finally becomes visible, stretching far beyond the confines of any single lifetime. He did not simply want his apprentice to become powerful in the Force. Though Plagueis would eventually rank among the most formidable Sith Lords in the entire history of the Order, he wanted his apprentice to become something closer to a permanent institution. A figure so deeply embedded in the legitimate structures of galactic power that his influence would persist and compound across generations, entirely independent of any single dramatic confrontation or battle. This meant training that extended far beyond lightsaber technique or raw command of the dark side. It meant teaching Plagueis how to move through galactic finance, how to accumulate influence within institutions like the Intergalactic Banking Clan, how to manipulate entire economies without ever once revealing the hand doing the manipulating. Tenebrous understood, perhaps more clearly than any Sith Lord who came before him, that armies could be destroyed and empires could fall, but a being who quietly controlled the flow of currency across an entire galaxy could survive almost any political catastrophe, simply by remaining useful to whoever happened to be in power at any given moment. This financial dimension of his teaching deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most quietly horrifying aspects of the entire lineage Tenebrous built. Where earlier generations of Sith had sought power through direct conquest, through fear, projected outward in the most visible and immediate ways possible, Tenebrous taught his apprentice to seek power through dependency instead. A being who commands an army can be resisted, fought, eventually defeated by a sufficiently determined enemy. A being who controls the credit lines an entire sector depends upon for its continued economic survival is far harder to resist, because resisting them means accepting economic collapse, a consequence most governments and most populations will avoid at almost any cost. Tenebrous taught Plagueis to build exactly that kind of leverage, patiently, over years and decades, cultivating relationships within banking institutions and trade organizations that would eventually give his apprentice influence over events and decisions across dozens of star systems, all without ever requiring a single lightsaber to be drawn or a single soldier to march. It is worth pausing here to consider just how thoroughly this approach inverted the traditional image of what a Sith Lord was supposed to be. The galaxy, when it thought of the Sith at all, imagined warriors and conquerors, beings who ruled through open displays of power and fear. Tenebrous built something almost entirely opposite, a form of Sith influence so subtle it barely resembled the dark side at all from the outside. No temples built in his honor, no armies marching under his banner, no declarations of war against the Republic or the Jedi Order. Simply a quiet, patient accumulation of financial and political leverage distributed across so many seemingly unconnected transactions and relationships that no single observer, however perceptive, could have traced the pattern back to its source. This was, in its own way, a far more terrifying vision of Sith power than anything the ancient Sith empires had ever managed to build through open warfare, because it left almost nothing for an enemy to actually fight. You cannot storm a fortress that does not exist. You cannot defeat an army that was never raised. You can only watch, slowly and with growing unease, as an entire economic and political system bends itself, seemingly of its own accord, toward outcomes that happen to serve interests nobody can quite identify. Tenebrous did not live to see the full fruit of this particular strategy, but he lived long enough to watch his apprentice begin building exactly the kind of quiet, compounding influence he had spent decades teaching him to construct. Plagueis, operating under a carefully maintained public identity as a respected and influential figure within galactic banking circles, began cultivating relationships and manipulating markets with a patience that mirrored his master's own, extending the timeline of the Sith Grand Plan even further into a future neither of them would personally witness in its entirety. Every lesson Tenebrous had given him about patience, about the danger of premature action, about the necessity of building influence so gradually that it never once triggered alarm, found direct expression in the methodical, decades-long project his apprentice was now quietly constructing. In this way, even before his death, Tenebrous had already begun to see the shape of his legacy taking form, not in some grand declaration of victory, but in the quiet, almost invisible accumulation of power. His apprentice carried out exactly as he had been trained to, and yet, for all the careful instruction, for all the years spent shaping his apprentice into the perfect vessel for a plan that would ultimately outlive them both, Tenebrous never seemed to consider, at least not in any way that altered his behavior, that the very qualities he was cultivating in his student, the coldness, the patience, the total willingness to treat even a beloved teacher as simply another variable in an ongoing calculation, would eventually be turned against him. This is, perhaps, the deepest and most disturbing irony buried inside the entire relationship between master and apprentice. Tenebrous spent years teaching Plagueis that sentiment was a weakness, that attachment clouded judgment, that the only sin a Sith Lord truly needed to fear was hesitation born of feeling. He taught these lessons so effectively, so thoroughly, that his own student would eventually apply them without a shred of hesitation to the one relationship in his life that might otherwise have given him pause. Whether Tenebrous ever recognized the shape of what was coming, whether some part of that vast, patient, calculating mind understood exactly how the story was going to end long before it actually did, remains one of the great unanswered questions buried inside his brief, quiet appearance in the history of the Sith. What is certain is that he never once altered course to prevent it. And in a philosophy built entirely around treating every outcome as simply another data point in an ongoing experiment, perhaps that was never really a possibility at all. There is a version of this story that focuses entirely on Plagueis, on the moon banker turned Sith Lord, who would eventually train the man who would destroy the Jedi Order and reshape the galaxy into an empire. That version is not wrong exactly, but it misses something essential, something that becomes visible only when you slow down and look closely at the figure standing quietly behind him, the teacher whose name almost nobody remembers, whose methods shaped every major decision his student would go on to make for the rest of his long and destructive life. Every piece of patience Plagueis demonstrated across his career, every willingness to wait decades rather than act in haste, every instinct to build influence through quiet financial manipulation rather than open confrontation traces directly back to lessons delivered in some unremarkable room by a Bith Sith Lord who never once raised his voice. In a very real sense, the fall of the Republic did not begin with Palpatine's rise to power, or even with Plagueis's careful cultivation of that rise. It began decades earlier, in the patient, methodical training of a mind willing to wait a lifetime for a victory it would never personally witness. This is, ultimately, what makes Tenebrous such a uniquely disturbing figure within the broader history of the Sith, even compared to lords who committed far more visible, far more dramatic atrocities across their lifetimes. He never conquered a world. He never led an army. He never stood before the galaxy and declared himself its master. And yet the pattern of thought he cultivated, the total, unwavering commitment to patience over impulse, calculation over emotion, long-term strategy over immediate gratification, proved to be the single most important ingredient in the eventual destruction of a 1,000-year-old republic and the near-total extermination of the Jedi Order. Every dramatic, visible catastrophe that followed, the purges, the wars, the rise of an empire built on fear, all of it rests on a foundation, laid quietly, invisibly, by a being whose face almost nobody in the galaxy would have recognized even if he had been standing directly in front of them. Consider, too, what this pattern suggests about the nature of the Sith lineage as a whole, stretching back through Tenebrous to his own master and forward through Plagueis to Palpatine and beyond. Each link in that chain inherited not simply raw power in the Force, but an entire inherited philosophy of patience and concealment, refined and sharpened across generations until it became almost impossible for the rest of the galaxy to detect at all. Tenebrous did not invent this philosophy from nothing. He inherited fragments of it from whoever trained him, added his own refinements, drawn from decades of obsessive research into forgotten Sith history, and pass the improved version forward to a student who would refine it further still. By the time that inheritance finally reached Palpatine, it had been tested, adjusted, and perfected across so many generations of careful practice that the Jedi Order, for all its wisdom and all its vigilance, never stood a real chance of detecting what was happening until it was already far too late to stop it. It is tempting, when telling a story like this, to search for some hidden moment of humanity buried beneath all that calculated coldness, some flicker of doubt or regret that might make Tenebrous feel less like a machine and more like a being capable of genuine feeling. The historical record offers almost nothing to support that search. What little survives of his private life, his private thoughts, his private moments away from the careful performance of teaching and calculation, suggests a mind that had, quite deliberately, stripped away almost everything that might be recognized as ordinary emotional experience, whether that stripping away was something forced upon him by his own master, in some earlier iteration of the same brutal training he would later inflict on Venomous and Plagueis, or whether it was simply the natural endpoint of a mind built from the very beginning around patience, calculation, and control, remains impossible to know for certain. What can be said with confidence is that by the time Tenebrous appears in any surviving account of Sith history, whatever capacity for ordinary feeling he might once have possessed had already been reduced to something almost undetectable, buried so deep beneath decades of discipline that it may as well not have existed at all. And perhaps that, in the end, is the true horror the story of Tenebrous leaves behind, more unsettling than any single act of cruelty scattered throughout his long and quiet life. It is not simply that he did terrible things, though he certainly did. It is that he did them without any of the psychological texture that usually accompanies villainy in stories the galaxy tells about itself. No tragic backstory offered as explanation. No moment of rage or grief that might make his choices feel, on some level, understandable. Just decades of patient, methodical work, carried out by a being who seemed to have arrived at total moral and emotional detachment, not through some single traumatic event, but simply as the accumulated result of a lifetime spent treating every relationship, every apprentice, every quiet act of cruelty, as nothing more than another carefully considered step toward an outcome he had already calculated with total confidence decades before it finally arrived. By the time his story reaches its final chapter, the shape of that outcome had already been set in motion for years, the pieces arranged with the same patient precision Tenebrous had applied to every other decision across his long and carefully hidden existence. What remained was simply the last measurement in an experiment that had, in truth, been running for the whole of his adult life. An experiment whose final result he had trained his own student, without ever quite saying so directly, to eventually deliver. That final chapter belongs to what comes next in this story, but it is worth sitting for just a moment longer, inside the strange quiet of everything that came before it. A being who could have ruled openly chose instead to disappear entirely into the crowd. A mind capable of reshaping galactic history chose to spend its days in unremarkable rooms, surrounded by dusty texts and half-forgotten records, patiently building something almost nobody alive would ever be permitted to see completed. Two students raised in secret, tested against one another without their knowledge. One discarded, one refined into the instrument of a plan that would eventually topple 1,000 years of Republic governance. And at the center of it all, a Sith Lord who never once raised his voice, never once revealed his true nature to anyone who did not absolutely need to know it, and never once, by any surviving account, showed the slightest hesitation about where his own careful, patient work was always going to lead. By the time the final chapter of his life arrived, Tenebrous had already spent decades constructing something far more dangerous than any weapon or army could ever be. He had built a mind, not simply trained it, the way any competent teacher might train a promising student, but built it piece by piece, lesson by lesson, until the apprentice standing across from him bore almost no resemblance to the uncertain young Moon who had first come to him seeking answers about the true nature of power. What remained after all those years of careful, patient instruction was something closer to a mirror than a student, a being who thought the way Tenebrous thought, who planned the way Tenebrous planned, who had absorbed not merely the techniques of the dark side, but the entire underlying philosophy of patience, detachment, and calculated cruelty that defined his master's approach to existence itself. And it is precisely because that mirror had become so perfect, so complete, that the ending which followed carries the particular horror it does. Tenebrous was not killed by a stranger or an enemy or some external force that caught him unprepared. He was killed by the single most successful product of his own life's work, using exactly the methods he himself had spent decades perfecting. The relationship between the two of them, in those final years, had settled into something that might have looked, from the outside, almost like partnership between equals. Plagueis had grown enormously in power and knowledge, no longer simply a student absorbing lessons but a Sith Lord in his own right, capable of conducting research and pursuing ambitions that occasionally extended beyond what his master had originally taught him. Tenebrous, for his part, seemed to permit this expansion, watching with the same detached, analytical interest he applied to every other aspect of his existence, as though observing how far his creation could grow before finally reaching the natural limit of what a student could achieve while a master still lived. There is a reading of this period, one that fits everything else we know about the mind of Tenebrous, in which he understood perfectly well what was happening, that his apprentice's growing confidence, his growing independence, his willingness to pursue lines of research and lines of political maneuvering that stretched beyond direct instruction were not signs of a relationship drifting toward danger, but simply the final, expected stage of an experiment reaching its natural conclusion. He had spent a lifetime teaching patience. He had spent a lifetime teaching that sentiment was weakness and hesitation was death. He would have been, in a strange way, disappointed if his apprentice had failed to eventually apply those lessons to him. What makes the actual moment of his death so quietly disturbing? More disturbing in many ways than the elaborate rituals and grand confrontations that mark the deaths of other Sith Lords throughout history is how small it was. How undramatic. There was no lightsaber duel, no clash of red blades illuminating some dark temple chamber, no desperate final display of power as one Sith Lord tried and failed to overcome another. Plagueis did not defeat his master through strength, because strength was never really the currency that mattered most between them. He used poison, administered quietly, patiently, during an ordinary moment of vulnerability, the kind of moment that occurs in every life, regardless of how much power a being wields or how many decades of training they have accumulated. Tenebrous, for all his careful discipline, for all his relentless focus on eliminating every weakness that might one day be exploited against him, still had to sleep, still had to eat, still had to, occasionally, lower the constant vigilance that had defined every other waking moment of his long and careful existence. And it was in exactly that narrow window, the one moment of ordinary human vulnerability that no amount of Sith training can fully eliminate, that his own creation finally struck. There is something almost unbearably fitting about the method Plagueis chose, something that reveals just how completely he had absorbed the deeper lessons of his training, rather than simply the surface techniques. A poison, carefully selected and carefully administered, is not a weapon of passion or rage. It is a weapon of patience, planning, and total emotional control. Exactly the qualities Tenebrous had spent years teaching his apprentice to value above all else. There was no confrontation in which Tenebrous might have had the chance to fight back. No dramatic moment of realization in which he understood, too late, what was happening to him. The entire event was designed, in the same way every major decision in Tenebrous's own life had been designed, to eliminate risk entirely, to ensure the outcome before it ever became visible as a choice at all. In choosing this method, Plagueis was not simply killing his master. He was demonstrating, with total, silent clarity, that he had learned everything Tenebrous had to teach, including the final and most important lesson of all. That sentiment has no place in the execution of a necessary outcome, regardless of who that outcome happens to fall upon. It is worth pausing here to consider what those final moments must have looked like. Insofar as anything can be reconstructed from fragments and reasonable inference, a being who had spent his entire adult life anticipating betrayal, who had built his whole existence around the assumption that every relationship, every alliance, every carefully cultivated student existed only for as long as it remained useful, finally experiencing the one outcome his philosophy had always insisted was inevitable. There is no surviving account of panic, no desperate final attempt to reverse the poison or lash out at his apprentice in those last moments of consciousness. If Tenebrous felt fear in that final passage, if some part of that vast, calculating mind experienced something recognizable as terror in the face of his own death, history offers no record of it. What can be said with more confidence is that nothing about the outcome should have surprised him. He had spent decades teaching that the rule of two guaranteed exactly this ending for every master who ever lived long enough to see an apprentice fully trained. He simply, in the end, became one more confirmation of a law he had spent his whole life enforcing on others. There is a particular kind of horror embedded in the idea that a being this intelligent, this careful, this relentlessly focused on eliminating every conceivable risk to his own survival, could nonetheless walk directly into an outcome he had spent his entire life both predicting and preparing his own successor to deliver. It raises an uncomfortable question that the story never quite answers directly. Did Tenebrous actually believe, on some level, that he might somehow be the exception? That decades of careful training, careful concealment, careful cultivation of a perfectly loyal apprentice might somehow allow him to escape the fate that had claimed every Sith master before him in that ancient, unbroken lineage? Or did he understand exactly what was coming and simply choose, with the same total detachment he brought to every other decision in his life, to let the experiment run its course regardless of the personal cost, because the successful completion of the experiment mattered more to him than his own continued existence ever did? The second possibility is, in many ways, the more disturbing of the two, because it suggests a being who had moved so far beyond ordinary self-preservation that even the prospect of his own death could be absorbed into the same cold, analytical framework he applied to everything else. Most beings, however disciplined, however committed to a cause larger than themselves, still retain some basic instinct toward continued survival. Tenebrous, if this reading is correct, had eliminated even that. He had built a mind so thoroughly organized around long-term outcomes rather than personal continuity that his own death, rather than representing failure, represented the final and most important success of everything he had worked to build. The rule of two had claimed him, exactly as it claimed every master before him. And in dying exactly according to that ancient, brutal law, he proved, more completely than any amount of continued survival could have, that his apprentice was ready to carry the lineage forward without him. Whatever the truth of his final thoughts, the practical consequences of his death unfolded with the same quiet efficiency that had defined every other aspect of his existence. There was no funeral, no monument, no public acknowledgement that a being of enormous hidden influence had just been removed from the galaxy. Plagueis simply absorbed everything his master had built. The knowledge, the connections, the carefully cultivated financial and political influence accumulated across decades of patient work and continued the plan forward, exactly as though the transition of power had always been the intended next step rather than the violent conclusion of a decades-long relationship. In this way, even in death, Tenebrous achieved something close to the immortality he had spent his life pursuing, not through any mystical transfer of consciousness or preservation of his physical form, but through the far simpler mechanism of having built a successor so complete, so thoroughly shaped in his own image, that the plan itself continued forward without interruption, as though the man who had originated it had never actually left. Consider what this means for the shape of history that followed, because the consequences of that quiet death in an unremarkable chamber somewhere in the galaxy would not become visible for generations. Plagueis, having absorbed everything his master had built, did not simply continue existing as a powerful Sith Lord operating in secret. He began, almost immediately, applying the same patient, methodical approach to the search for his own successor, exactly as Tenebrous had once searched for him. The pattern was repeating itself, link by link, exactly as it had for 1,000 years, except now it carried forward not simply the raw philosophy of the rule of two, but the specific, refined methodology Tenebrous had spent his life perfecting. Patience measured in decades rather than years. Concealment so complete, it barely resembled Sith activity at all. A total willingness to treat every relationship, including the most intimate bond between master and student, as fundamentally transactional, existing only for as long as it served the larger plan. It was this refined methodology, inherited directly from Tenebrous through Plagueis, that would eventually find its way into the mind of a young, ambitious politician from the world of Naboo. When Plagueis first encountered the being who would become Darth Sidious, he was not simply looking for raw talent in the Force, the way a less sophisticated Sith Lord might have searched. He was looking for a very specific combination of qualities his own master had spent years teaching him to recognize and cultivate. Patience beyond what any ordinary political ambition would require. A capacity for total emotional detachment, even in the pursuit of enormous personal ambition. And perhaps most importantly, a willingness to hide in plain sight for as long as necessary, building influence so gradually and so carefully that no observer, however vigilant, would ever notice the pattern taking shape until it was already far too late to interrupt it. This is where the true scale of what Tenebrous set in motion finally becomes visible, stretching across generations in a way almost no other figure in galactic history managed to achieve. The methods that eventually toppled the Republic, that dismantled the Jedi Order in what would come to be remembered as one of the greatest catastrophes in galactic history, were not improvised by Palpatine in the final years before his rise to total power. They were inherited, refined across multiple generations of careful teaching, tracing back through Plagueis to a quiet, unassuming Sith Lord whose name almost nobody in the galaxy would have recognized even at the height of his own influence. The slow cultivation of political power through seemingly legitimate channels, the patient manipulation of galactic institutions from within rather than through open conflict, the total concealment of dark side activity, behind the mask of respectable public life. Every one of these strategies, employed with such devastating effectiveness during the final decades of the Republic, had already been tested, refined, and proven across generations of Sith Lords who understood, thanks to the philosophy Tenebrous had spent his life perfecting, that visible power was always more vulnerable than invisible influence. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, one that adds an additional layer of horror to the entire story once you recognize it fully. The Jedi Order, across the centuries following the presumed extinction of the Sith, grew increasingly confident that their ancient enemies were gone for good, a confidence built largely on the absence of any visible Sith activity anywhere in the galaxy. What the Jedi failed to understand, generation after generation, was that this very absence of visible activity was not evidence of extinction at all. It was evidence of exactly the strategy Tenebrous had spent his life perfecting and passing forward. The Sith had not disappeared. They had simply become invisible, patient enough to wait for as long as necessary, disciplined enough to never once slip and reveal themselves through some moment of impulsive action. Every year the Jedi spent growing more confident in their own security was, in a very real sense, another year of proof that the strategy Tenebrous had built was working exactly as intended, allowing his lineage to operate completely undetected for far longer than open warfare ever could have achieved. This pattern of patient concealment did not end with Sidious. It continued, refined even further into the training of Sidious's own eventual apprentice, a fallen Jedi Knight named Anakin Skywalker, who would come to be known across the galaxy as Darth Vader. The connection here might seem more distant, given how dramatically different Vader's public role would eventually become compared to the quiet invisibility that had defined Tenebrous, Plagueis, and even much of Sidious's own rise to power. But the deeper philosophy remains visible if you know where to look for it. The patience required to cultivate a fallen Jedi from childhood, waiting years for exactly the right combination of vulnerability, ambition, and desperation to align before finally offering the choice that would seal his fate. The total willingness to treat even a supposedly beloved apprentice as fundamentally expendable, a tool to be used in service of the larger plan for as long as he remained useful. Even the eventual brutal betrayal that many students of Sith history recognize as the natural conclusion to every master and apprentice relationship built under the rule of two. Though in this particular case, the story would ultimately take an unusual turn few in the ancient lineage could have predicted. All of it traces back, link by link, generation by generation, to a philosophy first refined by a quiet, Sith Lord who never lived to see any of it come to pass. It is worth asking, at this point in the story, what exactly made Tenebrous different from the countless other Sith Lords who preceded him in that same lineage, many of whom also valued patience, also valued concealment, also understood the dangers of impulsive action. The answer seems to lie not in any single innovation, but in the totality of his commitment, the sheer completeness with which he applied these principles to every single aspect of his existence, without exception. Other Sith Lords throughout the history of the Bane lineage had practiced patience in certain areas of their lives while remaining vulnerable in others. Some maintained perfect discipline in their public personas while indulging dangerous impulses in private. Some accumulated enormous knowledge while neglecting the political and financial dimensions of power that would eventually prove decisive. Tenebrous appears to have been unusual, perhaps even unique within that lineage, in achieving total consistency across every dimension of his existence simultaneously. No private indulgences that might create vulnerability. No areas of his life where discipline relaxed even slightly. A completeness of concealment and calculation that few beings, force, sensitive or otherwise, have ever managed to sustain across an entire lifetime. This totality of discipline is, in many ways, the true horror at the center of the entire story, more disturbing than any single act of cruelty scattered throughout his long and quiet existence. It suggests a being who had, at some point, made a total and permanent choice to eliminate every part of himself that might be considered recognizably ordinary. No close friendships outside the narrow, calculated relationships with his apprentices. No indulgences, no private passions pursued purely for their own sake, rather than as instruments towards some larger goal. No visible moments of doubt, regret, or hesitation that might suggest an internal life recognizable to beings who have not undergone the same total transformation. Whatever Tenebrous once was, before he became the figure history barely remembers, that earlier self appears to have been systematically and completely erased, replaced by something closer to a perfectly calibrated instrument than a living being with an inner life of his own. And yet, for all that erasure, for all that totality of discipline and concealment, Tenebrous remained, in the end, a being capable of building something that would outlive him by generations, a legacy that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of galactic civilization. There is a lesson buried somewhere inside that contradiction, though it is not a comfortable one. The story of Tenebrous suggests that the most dangerous forms of evil in any galaxy are rarely the loud, visible, dramatic ones that announce themselves through open conflict and obvious cruelty. The most dangerous forms are the quiet ones, the patient ones, the forms of evil willing to work invisibly across decades or even centuries, indifferent to whether their architect ever personally witnesses the final outcome of their careful, methodical work. Tenebrous never conquered a single world. He never commanded a single army. He never stood before the galaxy and declared his intentions in any way that might have allowed the Jedi Order to recognize and confront the threat he represented. And yet the pattern of thought he cultivated, refined across generations through Plagueis and Sidious, and ultimately Vader, proved more destructive to the Republic and the Jedi Order than almost any single act of open warfare in galactic history. It is useful, at this point in the story, to step back and place Tenebrous alongside the other great names of the Bane lineage, because the comparison sharpens exactly what made him so uniquely unsettling. Darth Bane himself, the founder of the Rule of Two, was a being defined by dramatic transformation, a former miner turned Sith Lord who tore down an entire failed Sith empire through sheer force of will and replaced it with a philosophy built to survive where the old ways had failed. His story is one of destruction and rebirth, loud and consequential and impossible to miss even from a great historical distance. Sidious, generations later, would become perhaps the most publicly consequential Sith Lord in galactic history, a figure who ultimately ruled an entire empire in plain sight, his face known across 1,000 worlds even as his true nature remained hidden from almost everyone around him. Even Plagueis, for all his own careful concealment, left behind enough fragments of legend and rumor that his name would eventually surface in the story Palpatine told an impressionable young Jedi Knight about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a story significant enough to become one of the most quoted passages in the entire saga of the Skywalker family. Tenebrous left behind almost nothing. No dramatic transformation story. No public rule, however hidden. Not even the dignity of becoming a cautionary legend told by his own successors to tempt future apprentices toward the dark side. He simply vanishes into the historical record as a name attached to Plagueis's training. A footnote in someone else's story, exactly the outcome. His entire philosophy of concealment and patience was designed to produce. There is something worth sitting with in that outcome, because it suggests that Tenebrous succeeded, in the most literal sense, beyond what almost any other Sith Lord in history managed to achieve. He wanted to be invisible, and he remained invisible even in death, even in legend, even in the careful historical reconstructions that scholars and Jedi archivists would later attempt once the full scope of the Sith Grand Plan finally became clear. Bane is remembered. Sidious is remembered. Vividly and with lasting horror. Even Plagueis achieved a strange kind of posthumous fame through Palpatine's retelling. Tenebrous achieved nothing of the sort. And if you understand who he actually was and what he actually valued, you begin to realize that this absence of legend was never a failure at all. It was, in its own quiet way, his single greatest triumph. This raises an uncomfortable question worth considering carefully because it cuts against the way stories about villains are usually told. We tend to assume that the most dangerous figures in any history are the ones we remember most vividly, the ones whose names carry the heaviest weight of dread and fascination centuries after their deaths. The story of Tenebrous suggests something closer to the opposite might sometimes be true. Perhaps the figures who should actually frighten us most are the ones history barely remembers at all. Not because their influence was small, but because their influence was so completely successful at avoiding detection that even our retrospective attempts to understand them come up mostly empty. Bane and Sidious are terrifying because we can see the shape of what they did with total clarity. Tenebrous is terrifying for the opposite reason, because so much of what he actually did remains permanently obscured, buried beneath decades of deliberate concealment so effective that even historians examining the full wreckage of the Republic's collapse struggle to trace more than the barest outline of his involvement. There is a particular kind of dread that comes from confronting a gap like that in the historical record. A dread different from the fear inspired by a villain whose full story is known and documented. When we understand exactly what someone like Sidious did, we can, in some sense, contain that horror within the boundaries of the story itself. We know the scope of the damage. We know where it began and where it ended. With Tenebrous, that containment becomes impossible because the true scope of his influence, the full extent of what he built and taught and set in motion across decades of hidden work, likely extends far beyond anything the surviving fragments of his story actually reveal. For every piece of his legacy that historians and scholars have managed to reconstruct through Plagueis's own later actions and teachings, there are almost certainly other threads, other students, other quiet manipulations that left no trace at all, precisely because he was that thorough, precisely because concealment was never simply a tactic for him, but the entire organizing principle of his existence. Consider, for instance, how little is actually known about his activities beyond the training of his two secret apprentices. A being who lived for as long as Tenebrous apparently did, operating with total freedom and total concealment across decades of galactic history, almost certainly touched far more than two students across the whole of his lifetime. What became of whatever earlier apprentices he may have trained before Venemis and Plagueis? Apprentices whose fates might never have been recorded at all because Tenebrous, true to form, would have ensured no evidence of their existence survived him. What research did he conduct beyond the specific fragments that surfaced later in Plagueis's own scientific work? Research that might have simply been lost entirely, buried in some private archive, that was never discovered or was deliberately destroyed once it had served its purpose. What political manipulations did he personally orchestrate across galactic institutions during his own decades of active influence? Manipulations whose full consequences might still be rippling outward through galactic history in ways nobody has ever managed to trace back to their true origin. The honest answer to all of these questions is that nobody knows, and the not knowing is, in its own right, a significant part of what makes his story so quietly unsettling. We are not looking at the full portrait of a villain. We are looking at the small, deliberately preserved fragments a much larger figure chose to leave visible, while the vast majority of what he actually did remains permanently hidden by design. This uncertainty extends even to the most basic details of his life that we tend to take for granted with better documented historical figures. We do not know with any confidence how long Tenebrous actually lived before Plagueis finally ended his life. We do not know the full geography of his movements across the galaxy, which worlds he called home at various points, which institutions he quietly infiltrated and influenced during the decades before his death. We do not even know, with total certainty, whether Venemis and Plagueis represented the totality of his apprentices across his lifetime, or simply the two whose existence happened to survive in whatever fragments of Sith history Plagueis chose to preserve and eventually pass forward to his own students. Every one of these gaps in the record is not simply an accident of incomplete history. It is, in a very real sense, exactly the outcome Tenebrous spent his entire existence working to produce. A life so thoroughly concealed that even the beings who eventually pieced together fragments of his story centuries later could only ever recover the barest outline of who he actually was and what he actually accomplished. There is one more dimension of horror worth examining before this story reaches its natural end, and it concerns not what Tenebrous did, but what he represents about the deeper structure of the Sith philosophy he inherited and refined. The rule of two, as established by Bane 1,000 years before Tenebrous ever lived, was designed as a solution to a specific historical problem: the tendency of large groups of Sith Lords to destroy themselves through infighting and competing ambition before they could ever pose a serious, unified threat to the Jedi Order or the Republic. Bane's solution was elegant in its brutality. Reduce the number of Sith to exactly two, a master and an apprentice, and let the natural cycle of training and eventual betrayal ensure that only the strongest, most capable practitioners ever survived to continue the lineage forward. What Tenebrous demonstrates, through the entirety of his quiet, hidden existence, is just how far that original elegant solution could be pushed once a sufficiently patient and sufficiently disciplined mind fully committed to its logical extremes. Bane wanted survival of the fittest applied across generations of Sith Lords. Tenebrous applied that same principle with such totality that he was willing to secretly violate the very rule that made the survival mechanism function, running 2 apprentices in parallel purely to increase his own odds of producing a successful outcome, treating even the sacred foundational law of his entire order as simply another variable to be optimized, rather than a boundary to be respected. This willingness to bend even the most sacred rules of his own philosophy in service of a better outcome reveals something important about the true nature of the horror embedded inside this story. Tenebrous was never simply a villain following an established evil philosophy handed down to him by his predecessors. He was, in his own quiet and largely unrecognized way, an innovator. Someone who looked at the existing structure of Sith tradition and improved upon it, refined it, made it more efficient and more dangerous, exactly the way a scientist might refine an existing theory through careful experimentation and revision. That innovation, more than any single act of cruelty he committed across his lifetime, is perhaps the most disturbing legacy he left behind, because it demonstrates that evil, when approached with sufficient patience, sufficient intelligence, and sufficient willingness to treat every relationship and every rule as simply another factor in an ongoing calculation, does not remain static across generations. It evolves, it improves, it becomes, with each careful refinement, passed from master to apprentice, more efficient at achieving its goals, while leaving less and less trace of its own existence behind for anyone to discover until the damage has already become permanent and irreversible. It is worth imagining, for a moment, how differently galactic history might have unfolded had Tenebrous simply been a slightly less patient, slightly less disciplined figure than he actually was. If he had trained only a single apprentice rather than running 2 in parallel, the odds of producing a student capable of the specific combination of coldness and ambition that eventually defined Plagueis would have been meaningfully lower. If he had allowed himself even small indulgences, small moments of visible power or visible influence, the Jedi Order's historical confidence that the Sith had gone extinct might have been challenged decades or even centuries earlier than it actually was, potentially unraveling the entire grand plan before Plagueis and Sidious ever had the chance to bring it to completion. Every single one of the small, disciplined choices Tenebrous made across his long and largely undocumented life functioned as another load-bearing element in a structure that would not fully reveal its true shape until long after he was gone. Remove any one of those choices, and it becomes entirely plausible that the specific sequence of events leading to the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire simply never happens, at least not in the form the galaxy eventually experienced. This is, perhaps, the clearest way to understand exactly how much weight a single quiet, patient, largely forgotten figure can end up carrying across the arc of galactic history, even when that figure never lives to see any part of the outcome he worked so carefully to secure. There is a temptation, when confronting a story this bleak, to search for some counterbalancing force, some moment where the horror of what Tenebrous built might have been interrupted or prevented had circumstances aligned even slightly differently. The honest answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that very little in the surviving record suggests any serious Jedi ever came close to identifying the threat he represented while he was still alive to be stopped. This was, again, precisely the design. Tenebrous did not merely evade Jedi detection through luck or circumstance. He actively engineered an entire existence built around avoiding exactly the patterns of behavior the Jedi Order had learned to watch for over centuries of conflict with more visible, more impulsive Sith Lords. Every strategic choice he made, every lesson he passed forward to his apprentices, was calibrated specifically against the defensive instincts of an order that had grown extremely skilled at recognizing loud, obvious threats and correspondingly poor at recognizing threats built entirely around patience and silence. In this sense, Tenebrous did not simply happen to avoid capture. He studied the specific blind spots of his enemy across generations of careful observation and built his entire existence to live permanently inside those blind spots, untouched and unsuspected for the whole of his long, quiet life. This raises a broader and more uncomfortable question about the Jedi Order itself during this period, one worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over in service of a cleaner narrative. An order built around vigilance, around the careful monitoring of disturbances in the Force and dangerous concentrations of dark side activity, proved almost entirely blind to a threat that had chosen, deliberately and successfully, to generate as little detectable disturbance as possible across decades of active operation. This blindness was not simply bad luck. It reflected a genuine and significant limitation in how the Jedi Order had come to understand the nature of evil itself, an institutional assumption that danger would always eventually announce itself through some detectable disruption in the Force, some flare of anger or violence bright enough to be sensed from a distance. Tenebrous, and the entire lineage of patient, concealed Sith Lords he represented, exploited that assumption with devastating effectiveness, proving across generations that the most dangerous threats are often precisely the ones that refuse to generate any signal loud enough to be noticed until the damage has already become permanent. It is worth returning one final time to the image that opened this story. The picture of an unassuming Bith moving quietly through crowded galactic marketplaces, indistinguishable from any other member of his species going about ordinary business. That image is not simply a narrative device meant to create atmosphere. It is, in a very real sense, the truest possible summary of who Tenebrous actually was and how he actually operated across the whole of his existence. Not a dramatic figure cloaked in shadow, radiating visible menace the way popular imagination tends to picture Sith Lords. Simply an unremarkable presence, easily overlooked, easily forgotten. Precisely the kind of figure nobody thinks to watch closely, because nothing about the surface presentation suggests any reason to. And it is exactly that unremarkable surface, maintained with total discipline across decades of careful concealment, that allowed him to accomplish something far more consequential than almost any Sith Lord who ruled openly and visibly across the entire history of the Order. He did not need to be feared to be dangerous. He simply needed to be overlooked, and he was overlooked so completely, for so long, that by the time the consequences of his patient work finally became visible, they had already reshaped the fundamental structure of galactic civilization beyond any hope of easy reversal. There is a specific kind of chill that comes from realizing just how many other figures like Tenebrous might exist, or might have existed, throughout the vast, largely undocumented span of galactic history, hidden behind exactly the same kind of unremarkable, forgettable presentation that made him so effective. If a single Bith Sith Lord, operating with total discipline and total patience, could quietly shape the training of the apprentice, who eventually shaped the apprentice, who eventually toppled a 1,000-year-old republic, it becomes difficult to feel entirely confident that history, as it has actually been recorded and remembered, captures anything close to the full picture of who has genuinely shaped the course of galactic events across the centuries. Most historical narratives, by their very nature, tend to focus on the figures who left visible traces, the beings whose actions were loud enough, dramatic enough, consequential enough in the moment to be recorded and remembered by the people who witnessed them. Tenebrous represents a category of influence almost entirely invisible to that kind of historical process. And there is no particular reason to believe he was unique in that regard. He may simply be the rare example whose existence happened to surface, incompletely and imperfectly, through the later actions of a student who could not fully resist eventually referencing, however obliquely, the lineage he had inherited. This is, in the end, the quiet, lasting horror that a story like this leaves behind. A horror that lingers long after the specific details of poison and betrayal and secret apprentices have faded from immediate memory. It is not simply the horror of what one particular Sith Lord did across the span of his own hidden life. It is the horror of recognizing how thin the boundary actually is between the history we know and the history that was deliberately erased. How much of what shaped the galaxy we recognize may have been quietly engineered by figures who wanted, more than anything else, to never be recognized or remembered at all. Tenebrous succeeded in that ambition almost completely. His name survives only as a footnote attached to a more famous student's own story. A brief mention in the longer, better documented tragedy of Darth Plagueis, itself only remembered because Palpatine chose, for his own manipulative purposes, to tell a fragment of it to a Jedi Knight he was hoping to seduce toward the dark side. Without that single, strategic act of storytelling, it is entirely possible the name Tenebrous would have vanished from galactic history altogether, exactly as its owner would have wanted, a quiet, patient architect of catastrophe who spent an entire lifetime ensuring that even his own death would leave behind nothing more than the faintest possible trace. And perhaps that is the final, most unsettling thought this story leaves behind. Somewhere in the deep, largely unrecorded history of the galaxy, in the quiet spaces between the dramatic, well-documented conflicts that dominate the histories we actually know, there were almost certainly other figures like Tenebrous, patient, disciplined, entirely committed to remaining invisible across the whole of their existence, whose influence on the shape of galactic civilization we will simply never have the ability to trace or understand. We know about Tenebrous only because of a fragile, largely accidental chain of transmission. A story told for manipulative reasons by his own grand apprentice, preserved just barely long enough for later historians to piece together the outline of who he actually was. For every figure whose story survived through some similarly fragile accident of history, there may be dozens or hundreds whose existence left no trace at all, whose careful, patient work quietly shaped events in ways nobody now alive will ever have the ability to recognize or understand. That is the true, lasting horror at the heart of this story, more disturbing than any single detail of poison, betrayal, or secret experimentation. It is the horror of realizing just how much of what shapes the world around us may be invisible by design, engineered specifically to be forgotten, hidden behind the unremarkable, forgettable faces of beings who spent their entire lives making absolutely certain that no one would ever think to look twice. There is a final piece of this story worth examining, one that returns us to the specific relationship between Tenebrous and the two students who defined the last decades of his existence, because it offers perhaps the clearest window into exactly what kind of legacy he intended to leave behind. Whether or not he ever consciously articulated that intention, even to himself. Consider the fundamentally different fates of Venomous and Plagueis. Two beings trained by the same master, taught largely the same foundational philosophy, subjected to the same total absence of warmth or genuine affection across years of careful, patient instruction. One of them was defeated, reduced to a living experiment, kept alive only as raw material for his rival's ongoing research into the boundaries between life and death. The other absorbed every lesson so completely that he eventually became not merely his master's successor, but something closer to his master's perfect continuation, a being who would go on to shape the training of Sidious with methods so precisely inherited from Tenebrous that entire strategic patterns repeat themselves almost exactly across 3 separate generations of the same lineage. What separated these two outcomes was never simply raw talent in the Force, though both students undoubtedly possessed significant power by any reasonable measure. What separated them was the specific quality Tenebrous valued above every other trait he attempted to cultivate in his students. A totality of detachment so complete that it could survive contact with genuine crisis without ever once cracking under the pressure. Venomous, for all his discipline, retained something Tenebrous ultimately judged insufficient. Some residual capacity for feeling that made him, in the end, the wrong investment. Plagueis retained nothing of the sort. Or if he did, he had learned early enough to conceal it so completely that even his own master, a being whose entire existence was built around detecting exactly this kind of weakness in others, found no trace of it worth acting upon. This is, perhaps, the single most important thing to understand about the philosophy Tenebrous spent his life refining and passing forward. It was never really about power in any conventional sense. It was about the total, permanent elimination of every quality that might one day introduce hesitation into a decision that needed to be made without hesitation. And the students who survived his training were, by definition, the ones who had succeeded most completely in eliminating exactly that. There is something worth noting about how this specific selection pressure, applied across generation after generation of the same lineage, would have compounded over time in ways that likely made each successive Sith Lord in that chain colder and more effective than the one before. Tenebrous inherited a philosophy of patience and concealment from whichever master trained him, refined it across decades of his own careful practice, and then selected, from 2 competing candidates, the student who had absorbed that refined philosophy most completely. Plagueis, in turn, would apply the same selection pressure to his own search for a successor, looking specifically for a mind capable of matching or exceeding the total detachment his own master had demonstrated. Each generation, in other words, was not simply inheriting the philosophy of the one before it. Each generation was being selected, deliberately and systematically, for an even more complete version of that same total emotional and psychological detachment, a process that, left to run for long enough, would eventually produce exactly the kind of ruthlessly efficient, almost inhumanly patient figure that Sidious would ultimately become, and that Vader, in his own more complicated and eventually redeemed way, was originally intended to represent as well. This compounding effect across generations is, in many ways, the true engine behind the eventual collapse of the Republic and the Jedi Order, more fundamental even than any single decision made by Palpatine during his own rise to power. The Republic did not fall because one uniquely brilliant, uniquely evil individual happened to emerge at exactly the right historical moment to exploit its weaknesses. It fell because a 1,000-year selection process, refined across generation after generation of the Bane lineage, had been systematically producing increasingly effective practitioners of patience, concealment, and total emotional detachment, each one slightly better calibrated than the last to exploit exactly the specific blind spots the Jedi Order had developed over centuries of complacent peace. Tenebrous represents one crucial link in that long chain of refinement. Arguably, one of the most important links, given how directly his specific methods, the parallel training of secret apprentices, the total commitment to invisible political and financial influence, the total elimination of anything resembling genuine attachment, can be traced forward through Plagueis and into the final devastating form the strategy took under Sidious. It is worth acknowledging, before this story reaches its final close, that there is something almost paradoxical about spending this much time and attention on a figure who spent his entire existence trying to ensure that no one would ever spend exactly this kind of time and attention on him. Every detail explored across this story represents, in some sense, a small failure of the total concealment Tenebrous worked so hard to achieve, fragments of information that survived despite his best efforts to ensure nothing would. And yet, even in that partial failure, the story confirms, rather than contradicts, everything it reveals about who he actually was. We know about Tenebrous only through the barest possible outline, a name, a species, a rough sketch of his methods, and his relationship to two students whose own stories happened to survive more completely. We do not know his private thoughts, his private doubts. Whatever traces of an inner life might have existed beneath all that careful discipline, we know him almost entirely through the shape of the absence he left behind. The negative space carved out by everything he successfully prevented the galaxy from ever learning about him. In this sense, even this story, however much detail it manages to reconstruct, remains fundamentally incomplete in exactly the way its subject would have wanted. A partial shadow cast by a being who spent his entire existence making certain that no one would ever see him standing fully in the light. That incompleteness is, in the final accounting, the most honest note on which to end this story, because it mirrors the actual historical reality of who Tenebrous was and how thoroughly he succeeded in disappearing from the record he helped shape so profoundly. We began with the image of a quiet, unremarkable Bith moving through crowded galactic marketplaces, invisible among beings who never once suspected what was walking among them. We end with the recognition that this invisibility was never accidental, never simply a fortunate byproduct of an unassuming species or an unremarkable public persona. It was the entire point, cultivated with the same total discipline he applied to every other aspect of his long, patient existence. And it succeeded so completely that centuries later, the full shape of what he actually built, what he actually destroyed, and how many lives across how many worlds were ultimately touched by the quiet, invisible machinery he set into motion, remains permanently, deliberately, and perhaps irrecoverably lost to history. A Sith Lord who never needed the galaxy to fear him, because he had already given it something far more dangerous than fear. He had given it inevitability, patient and silent, and utterly invisible, waiting in the shadows for generations until the day it finally, quietly, irreversibly arrived. There is one last thought worth carrying away from this story, one final image to hold on to as the shadow of Tenebrous recedes back into the largely unrecorded depths of galactic history, from which it briefly, partially emerged, somewhere in some unremarkable room on some world whose name has not survived the centuries. A Sith Lord once sat across from a promising young student and began, patiently and methodically, the process of teaching him exactly how to eventually end his own life. He did this not out of some hidden death wish, not out of despair or exhaustion with his own long existence, but because he understood more completely than almost any other figure in the entire history of the Sith that the true measure of a life spent in service of the dark side was never whether the Master himself survived to witness the final outcome. It was whether the pattern he built, the philosophy he refined, the patient, invisible machinery he set into motion would continue running long after he was gone, carrying his methods forward into a future he would never see, shaping the fate of a galaxy that would never know his name, exactly as he had always intended it to. In that sense, and perhaps only in that sense, Darth Tenebrous achieved precisely what he set out to achieve. A victory so complete, so total, so perfectly concealed, that its full horror only becomes visible generations later to anyone patient enough and careful enough to finally trace the quiet, unbroken thread all the way back to where it truly began. And so the story of Darth Tenebrous ends the way it began. In silence, in shadow, in the quiet absence of anything resembling a monument or a legend. No grave marker bears his name. No holocron preserves his voice for future generations of Sith to study and admire. No statue stands anywhere in the galaxy to commemorate the mind that patiently, invisibly, set in motion the chain of events that would eventually consume 1,000 years of Republic governance and an entire order of Jedi Knights who never saw it coming. He remains, even now, exactly what he spent his entire existence working to become. A name barely remembered, a shadow behind a shadow, the quiet, patient origin point of a horror so vast and so slow-moving that by the time anyone finally understood its true shape, there was nothing left to do but watch it finish what he had started generations before, in a room nobody thought to search, teaching a lesson nobody thought to fear.